New Zealand may be a small country, but in the wider world what we do, use and consume affects lives everywhere. So I'm on a mission to see how we're treating our backyards both here and further afield. What are we doing to be cleaner and greener? What do we need to change? And what does the future hold? So join me to Radar as I go global. Don't worry, I'll plant plenty of trees to offset the travel. Now, where's my passport? You could say that this dripping tap is a wetaphor. That's a metaphor about water, a substance that you and I use hundreds of litres of every day. And not just for washing, drinking and flushing the loo. Water use is often invisible. It may be news to you that it takes 300 litres of water to make a newspaper, and half a kilogram of coffee takes 11,000 litres to produce. That makes my morning routine pretty moist. So it's crucial that the water we do have is kept as pure as possible. Here in Henikura, water issues are at boiling point. It does feel all very country calendar this particular moment, doesn't it?
Yes, it is very country calendar.
Grant and his dogs are guardians of the river because he says someone has to stand their ground on water purity. Obviously we've had quite a lot of rain, so the river looks a little bit discoloured. Does it look like that most of the year?
It does really. It only runs clear after there's been no rain for about 4 to 5 weeks. Settle down. 10 years ago, the river was nothing like this. It ran clear most of the time. On this particular spot we used to call the trout pool, and there'd be trout jumping all over the place. There's just no fish in the river at all at the moment. And there's no towns putting sewage into it, or there's no industry. There's only agriculture. And the intensification of that agriculture over the last decade, primarily with the increase in beef and lamb prices, have made farmers focus more on that intensive style of farming. And of course that's brought the chemicals and the runoff and put the pressure on the land.
How do you fix that?
To me it's pretty simple. It's called a fence. If we fence off our rivers and if we farm with a far more of an environmental consciousness, which is putting on less fertiliser, controlling fertilisers, looking at erosion, planting the slipping hills, then we'll fix this within a space of 5 years, if we do it starting now. If we leave this for another 10 years, it's going to take us 20 years to turn it around.
There are probably people who would look at this river and think, well, we're in the middle of nowhere. Yeah. No one ever sees it, so what?
What's the point? Exactly.
Yeah. So who are you to come and say, hey, stop doing that?
Exactly right.
You must have been one of the least popular men in the district.
I was. I hated my guts. But, you know, I just couldn't watch the destruction that was occurring. And also, too, it was affecting me personally because my properties, as you can see, it's surrounded by the river. And so anything that happens on the river affects me personally, yeah. Here we have a really good hole in the river that I use to draw my drinking water out of, and my household water. But there's a dead cow washed up on the debris there. If
it was a decent day for eeling, I suspect we'd either have a very good chance of catching some because they'd all be here, or we'd have an appalling chance because they would have gorged themselves on dead cow.
Eels can't even live in the river. There's no oxygen in the water. The mana of New Zealand, of Aotearoa, is in its fresh water and its environment. This is the mana of our country. We've got to start doing something to look after it, otherwise it will go.
One of the problems with water pollution is that often you can't see the chemical reactions going on, so you can't see the damage. If you've ever marvelled at the colours of a rainbow in a puddle, then you've been seduced by pollution. Oil and water don't mix, but water dissolves more stuff than any other liquid. H2O is made up of 2 hydrogen molecules and 1 oxygen molecule. But when organic matter ends up in the water, it adds nitrogen, which binds with the oxygen and so makes it unavailable for fish to breathe. Which is partly why New Zealand's long-finned eel has ended up on the endangered list. Baby eels have a homing device, so they only return to the river their parents came from and nowhere else. If that river has no oxygen available, they'll still swim up it until they die. I think we'd probably be a little bit more worried about the welfare of the eel if they were perhaps more traditionally beautiful, like a gurnard. I think it's one thing for a population of eels to run out of food, but if they can't actually breathe, that's a pretty significant problem for them. But you can't generally look at a river and go, oh, there's no oxygen in that, because it just looks like water. even though I suppose technically it isn't water because water is H2O. If you take out the oxygen, then what do you get left? You just get sort of just H. A little bit of light reading. This is one of our regional council's draft policy statement on environmental matters, and you think, gosh, this has got to cover everything. There's coastal areas, there's indigenous biological diversity, water management values, discharges, a lot of talk of discharge. I had the feeling when I got this that this would be singularly the most boring documents I've ever had the misfortune to lug around, but I found it absolutely fascinating. For example, the sand, shingle, shell, driftwood or dead seaweed shall be for private use only and not for sale or exchange. So you can sell or exchange live seaweed, but dead seaweed, verboten. Tell you what, you can keep your Harry Potters and your Hobbits. This is a magical document with very good cartography.
And while they don't please everyone, these documents exist for a reason. The mighty Mississippi River is one of the world's great waterways. Unfortunately, it's also so polluted that its outflow creates a massive dead zone when it hits the Gulf of Mexico. While the BP oil disaster made global headlines for the environmental chaos it caused in the same waters, the dead zone barely rates a mention. Mississippi River keeper Paul believes that needs to change.
So some of this water may well have come from as far away as Canada.
That's true. 44% of North America drains through the Mississippi River Valley and all the way down through the center of America, basically, and all out through here.
It's kind of like the aorta of the country in a way.
There's right around 200 major petrochemical facilities between Baton Rouge and New Orleans on the river. All the big names, Exxon, Mobil, Dow, Monsanto, everybody you can think of. And the water, of course, is our lifeblood. What sustains the communities and sustains the economy.
Some people would maybe think of it more like a colon.
Right, yeah. And of course now we're facing real problems because it's been treated that way.
So down here there's a discharge.
There is the sewage treatment plant for the northern part of Baton Rouge. They've been having lots of trouble keeping within their discharge permit. And so come out here a few times when it's just basically raw sewage coming out into the river.
Right, that's far from ideal.
Yeah, no, it's no good.
There's been cities all the way for the last couple of thousand miles discharging stuff into it, agricultural nutrients. What happens when it hits the Gulf of Mexico?
Well, those nutrients fuel the growth of algae, and the algae is eaten by phytoplankton. And then when it dies, it settles down to the bottom, and bacteria eat it. And when the bacteria eat it, the water gets so deoxygenated that the sea life either flees from the area or dies if it can't.
People hear that a river's full of nutrients. They might assume that that's got to be a good thing.
Right. It would seem that way, but it can cause some really bad problems. I think part of the problem is that you can't really see the dead zone.
It's just water, isn't it?
Right, it just looks like the ocean. But
it's not a different color, or?
No, you can't see any difference. But then when the fishermen go out, you know, there's no shrimp, there's no crabs, there's no fish.
How do you go about starting to clean up a river of this size?
Once it's in the water, there's only so much you can do. But if we can get people to not put it in the first place, that's really where you can make a big difference.
It's almost incomprehensible to imagine having a dead zone, certainly not one the size of the one that they have in the Gulf of Mexico, anywhere in New Zealand. We got all hit up about an algal bloom. Maybe we just need to think about our rivers a little bit more.
I'm in Peru's Sacred Valley under the Chicon Glacier, where there's double trouble with water. 70% of Peru's glaciers could vanish in the next decade, and what little water does flow downstream is poisoning the locals. I'm with John, who is trying to turn this ice water back into nice water.
And you think of Peru, you think of the Andes, you think of crystal clear mountain streams flowing down to the sea. It's not really like that.
Well, it is like that. Unfortunately, that crystal clear water is full of horrible things that make you very sick, mainly because of agriculture and population boom. About 80% of children are malnourished because of the terrible water quality that they have. So the most effective way to reduce child malnutrition is filtering water in someone's home.
Buenos dias.
Buenos dias. So here's our water filter.
Before the water filter, what did you use?
Antes del filtro, ¿qué usabas?
Tapina.
Just water from the tap.
They get sickness?
Siempre había.
Siempre había?
Microbios.
There's microbials.
In any language, really, microbes translates as it's not a good thing. How does she feel about the glacier disappearing?
Ya no va a haber mucha agua.
Sí.
¿Qué agua vamos a tomar?
See, it's disappearing, so what water are they going to drink, you know?
Not rainwater.
No.
No.
Agua de lluvia, no.
No hay lluvia, también de qué lluvia.
There isn't any rain either, so...
No.
John and I are putting our bodies on the line to prove his filters work via a cup of bean tea.
Muchas gracias. Cheers.
Cheers. Bean tea, that's lovely. It's like caramel popcorn.
Delicious.
Yeah, really good.
Although the glacier might vanish, people's water worries won't. So John's working with charity Pro World, making basic terracotta water filters. Life-changing pottery that costs about the same as a copy of this program on DVD.
I'm failing to understand how exactly this filters water.
So the filter has a number of pores that you can't really see. And so when you put water in the top of the bucket, it just seeps through slowly so that it's well filtered.
That would explain why it's so light.
Exactly. And then we coat it in colloidal silver. Colloidal silver kills the microbacterial contaminants that are in the water that are too small to be filtered out by the pores.
Gosh, that seems remarkably simple.
In the early 70s, actually, in Nicaragua, Potters for Peace developed this design, and they're a wonderful non-profit who help other non-profits around the world use this technology and produce filters locally.
Because I guess there are a lot of potters who aren't doing anything like this who are also non-profit because no one will buy their terrible clay mugs. They want to join Potters for Peace and get involved with this.
Exactly.
Right. Gosh.
We make all of our water filters here. The clay's local, we buy the buckets locally, we make everything locally, which is important for us in terms of generating local jobs.
Where does the sawdust fit in?
The sawdust is mixed in with the clay, and then when the filter is fired in our kiln, the sawdust burns little tiny holes in the filter, and that's what makes it porous. This is Ernestina, our water filter project coordinator.
Buenas tardes.
Muy buenas tardes. Años atrás, hace
15 years ago, the river was clean. She used to go to the river with her brothers and sisters and with all her friends, and they would take a load of bottles down there and they would start swimming and collect fish in the bottles, but they now call it a dead river. There are no fish that live in that river.
No, ya no vamos porque ahora en
When
el
people
río
do swim in the river,
le dan
they get
unas,
these spots all over their skin, and so she doesn't let her children swim in the river, obviously.
No, rightly so. So what's the Spanish word for dead river?
Río muerto.
Clean water is not something we generally worry about until disaster strikes, and then we're left clutching at straws. Fortunately, Ben dispatches life straws to the third world and disaster zones.
I would not normally advocate the drinking of water from a pond, but I think today we'll give it a go. Wow. Yeah, that is some nasty looking water.
Yeah. Why don't you drink it with your straw, and I'll use the life straw.
All right, and then we'll wait 18 hours and see who's doing better off. So by putting that into there and drinking, that will take out pretty much anything that could cause me any illness.
Any waterborne pathogen will be filtered out.
Right.
So I'll let you
Would you?
do the honors.
That's very good of you. Wow, look at that.
Wow.
Far out.
Ladies and gentlemen, there you have it.
I've just purified water using my own body. And then I can just drink that straight.
There you go.
There.
Cheers.
Cheers. Do you want to go? You'll probably catch something from me. That would be the disaster. And it's like we're sharing the peace pipe in a way. I wanted to get one of these and put it in my disaster preparation kit, because I can never be bothered. They always say you should have 3 days of water stored, and you go, oh, I've got, you know, a wine cellar. Well, I say a wine cellar.
So
I've got some wine in a box in the, you know, and something like that. You just put it there with some dehydrated food. Bob's your uncle. Do you have that phrase here?
No.
Ah yes, Global Radar, doing its bit for intercultural understanding.
In its first year, the Keep Wellington Beautiful campaign has already reduced litter by 17%. Another successful Keep New Zealand Beautiful program.
New Zealand is beautiful, but if we actually want to be 100% pure, we ought to start with water. like Mike and Greg from Stormwater360, who are cleaning Auckland's urban runoff.
I'm imagining that most of the people in these cars are totally unaware of where any of this water is actually going.
Nobody really thinks about where the rainwater goes or what's in the rainwater, really.
No.
People just think it's clean water.
Yeah.
And it picks up everything that's been on the road. Rubbish,
Brake linings, clutch linings, soluble heavy metals.
you've got a car tyre.
I feel dirty. Even just walking here, I want to go home and have a shower. Aren't there any quality control with stormwater release type things? You know, I guess you would have thought that there would be a system. It wouldn't just run off and go into the sea.
Well, it was built many years ago when they built the city, and that's when they thought stormwater was clean. So there was no emphasis put on managing it. In Auckland City, there's 100,000 cesspits.
There it is.
It's about a month work. So you want to times this by 100,000 times 12, and that's how much you're getting it going into the harbour each year. I don't know what we've got here, mainly cigarette butts, polystyrene, that's a killer on marine life.
We would be aghast if the council came around and picked up rubbish from rubbish bins and then drove down to the sea and poured it in.
Exactly, yeah, it's the same thing really, isn't it? And also trying to clean it up when you're down in the ocean, there's a lot more money and time and cost as well.
It dissipates over a huge area, whereas here, you know, we're catching it the first place where it's going into the pits.
Is it a bit like putting a Band-Aid on a massive hemorrhaging wound?
Yeah, you're right. The hemorrhaging wound is the fact that there is so much stuff that never breaks down. We've got to really stop using the amount of plastics we're using, but what do we do in the meantime before we have that cultural change? It's going to just keep on going into the harbour.
It's also education. Your cigarette butt being flicked into the pit actually ends up in the harbour. It's not a rubbish bin.
There are also larger units to stop motorway goop from gushing into the sea.
Fall into here.
The water comes off the motorway, down to here, and out to the harbour.
Right, that's horrible.
That's motorway soup.
Like a slurry of asphalt and motorway tyres and other small particulates. And so essentially all of that is being stopped by those filters from going out into the sea.
Plus what you can't see is obviously dissolved metals in there, so I wouldn't be drinking this. This is the storm filter. It filters fine suspended solids, hydrocarbons and heavy metals out of the stormwater.
Right. How does it do that?
Water is sucked through this media down the centre and out a drain at the bottom.
Right.
This is a spent one. It's full of hydrocarbons and dirt and car tyres. Here's a clean cartridge. This one hasn't been put on the ground yet, and you can see filter media, the perlite in this one, beautiful and clean. And 1 year later it ends up like this. See what it looks like when it comes out of the filters.
Get that out of there. That looks better.
Very much better. And there we have it.
Right.
Dirty water to clean water.
That is quite an astounding difference. Just thinking about just how much rubbish was caught in that one water pit. Extrapolate that out over an entire city, that is a lot of rubbish. Amazing that you can have these high density areas, you know, such as an apartment building where the numbers of cigarette butts are astronomical. Because I guess you get people sitting on their balconies smoking cigarettes and then just throwing them out into the street. Problem solved, it's gone away. Only it hasn't gone away. And it does astound me that we still, or not we, I mean, not me, obviously, possibly not you, but some people still don't really think that a cigarette butt is waste, when really what they are is these toxic little bullets that people just discard willy-nilly into the environment. Disgusting. Feel like some kind of old man. It's disgusting. If I had a cane, I would wave it at this point and gesticulate wildly, but I can't do that within the confines of my tent. It's disgusting.
Next stop, the Manawatu, home to one of New Zealand's most polluted rivers. But there may be a way to clean it and make useful fertiliser at the same time. Plants need phosphorus to grow, but worldwide it's in short supply. Most of us, however, dispose of some daily, which is why I'm at a sewage oxidation plant to meet Massey University scientists Andy and Nicola.
We're flushing a whole lot of this valuable resource down the toilet, literally and figuratively. What's going on out there right now?
What's happening is we get a whole lot of algae growing. These ponds are really good at removing most things, but one of the challenges is phosphorus. And just like your garden needs nutrients, these algae need nutrients too, and they take up quite a bit, but they don't quite get it all. And so what we have here is we have to dose chemicals in to try and get rid of it. But what we'd like to do is get rid of those chemicals. We want these algae to do their job better.
And so you're essentially looking for a very hungry form of algae that will eat all the phosphorus.
Yeah.
So simple.
It's got to be simple, eh? We've concentrated ourselves into communities, we've concentrated our animals, we've concentrated industries, and so you end up with a concentrated form of pollution. So all we're doing here is we're taking the same bacteria, algae that you find in nature, and just concentrating it up.
Nature, eh?
Yeah.
Shall we get out of the nature? Because this is a little bit too much nature for me.
Thankfully, Massey University has a warm lab handy.
Is it possible to harvest those algae and remove the phosphorus, or do you leave it in the algae and spread it on the pasture?
Yeah, you probably leave it in the algae. It would be much easier to spread that, and you also get a bit of sort of organic matter and things in there as well. There'd also be a whole lot of nitrogen and other trace elements in there too. So it'd be quite a well-balanced fertiliser.
There's always biotech applications downstream, but today it's like, just how can we clean up for waterways? And this is a very promising technique for that.
Sometimes I think that a lot of us just assume that if there is a problem with, for example, a river, that there is someone out there whose job it is to make sure that that problem doesn't exist, when it's becoming increasingly sort of obvious that often there isn't. As a complex society, we're never all going to agree upon the standard that a river should be at and the action that should be taken, but I think at the very least there should be a base from which we can all come together and go, yeah, no, we don't think that's appropriate. I love science, and it's heartening to see just how much research is being done into cleaning up waterways, but can you just imagine how much other research could be done if we didn't have to do that because we weren't putting anything in the waterways to begin with? Food for thought. Wash it down with a nice cool glass of crystal clear drinking water. Adam's ale, my grandfather used to call it. Here's to you, Grandad. And you, Adam, with your excellent crystal clean ale.
Tune in next week for more water cooler facts on local food. I'm off to Peru, which is actually the home of the Maori potato and kumara, and I find out how honey smugglers are targeting our golden goodness.